Thanks to some helping hands around the congregation, we have this podium or lectern that adjusts in height, so I have one that's my height. Just wanted to say that, so thanks, guys. And I will try to include the choir, so we'll do some pirouettes now and again. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord our God, bless us with your word that we may hear you speaking to us in new ways that move us to love you more deeply and to live with our neighbors more compassionately. Strengthen us here today and fill us with what we need to love and serve you and one another. Amen. Well, just a little bit later in today's service, as in most of our worship services, our assisting minister, Monty, today, will lead us in sharing the peace. The peace of Christ be with you, he will say. And then we say, and also with you. Then we then we reach out to one another across the aisle, in front of us, behind us. We clasp hands and we exchange a friendly God's peace be with you. And then, after just a couple of minutes, we return to our seats, feeling quite uplifted by the friendly, warm welcome that we have given and received. I do love this part of our service. And I believe that sharing the peace is much more. It is a powerful force for living together in community, not only here, but beyond these walls. So I ask you to hold that thought, the thought about sharing the peace, for a few minutes. For now, let's look back. We'll have just a little Bible history here. We heard Monty read quite a long reading from Deuteronomy. And Moses here in Deuteronomy is addressing the Israelites as they are about to cross into the promised land. And this is the second time that Moses has presented the Ten Commandments. And in fact, Deuteronomy means the second law. So, we need to dial back 40 years to the first giving of the law, which is a whole generation earlier, which we find in Exodus and chapters around that. In this time of the first law, the Israelites had been miraculously delivered from Egypt through the Red Sea with Moses guiding them, Moses, God's servant. And if you happen to have been here last week, we talked about the burning bush. We observed a burning bush which was sitting over there, and God speaking from the bush and calling Moses to serve. So Moses was in action as God's servant. But the Israelites, after their deliverance from Egypt, had quickly fallen to complaining and quarreling, even to the point of lamenting, "Oh, we would have been better off had we died in Egypt as their slaves, rather than be here in the wilderness, hungry and thirsty." Time and time again, Moses, as a faithful and sometimes patient servant, he reminded them of God's steadfast and protective love and of God's guidance for them. The Israelites, during this time in the wilderness, were, let's say, a pathetic example of living well together in community. So God commanded Moses to climb Mount Sinai, also known as, in Deuteronomy, Mount Horeb. So those two are the same mountain. Here God made a covenant with the Israelites through Moses by giving Moses the 10 Commandments. And now we see, instead of the burning bush, we have this carving of Moses holding the 10 Commandments and the Bible nearby. So at this time on the mountain, God says, I, the Lord your God, it is I who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, love your God and love your neighbor and live together in peace and harmony by following these commandments. And the people vowed that they would live by these commandments, but they quickly broke their promise. Moses had a lot cut out for him when he agreed to be God's servant. So now, fast forward 40 years, again to Deuteronomy, which is where we just began. Moses presents the same covenant and commandments, this time to a whole new generation. And just like their ancestors who had escaped from Egypt, this current generation needs to be reminded how God has liberated them from their own sorts of slavery that they had experienced in the wilderness. They needed to be assured that God will continue to be with them as they cross into the promised land, and then will continue to be with them in this new land and this new life. And they will thrive in this new land as a people by following God's commandments. As did the Israelites and the many, many generations before us, we still today need guidelines and commandments for loving God and for living together in community. Let's face it, we're humans. And as such, we naturally take care of, number one, first. Consider babies. I'm a grandmother now, and I have a 1-year-old, and I'm relearning everything I didn't learn as a parent, or I forgot an awful lot. Well, from his little 1-year-old perspective, the world's attention is centered on him alone and his particular needs and wants, with really still at this point no awareness of others' needs and wants. But gradually he and other babies learn that certain actions please their mommy and their daddy and their caregiver and maybe their grandma and grandpa. And some things are acceptable and pleasing. Thank you for sharing your cracker with me. And some things are not acceptable and not pleasing. It's not nice to bite. Right. That's what I said. Right there. Then children learn from parents and teachers that consideration for others contributes to the good of all as well as to the good of themselves. For instance, when students go on a field trip, or maybe when the Glow women go on a retreat, everyone must obey the safety rules. Because if someone gets hurt, the trip is canceled, and the bus or the van or all the cars need to take everybody back home. This makes sense, whether we're a child, a youth, or an adult. Our own welfare is indeed dependent upon those around us. And God also challenges us to greater, less rational degrees of loving one another and living together well. In the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 12, Jesus sums up the commandments that we heard today. The first is, Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." The second is this: "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." There is no other commandment greater than these. Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Such a degree of love for God and others doesn't really make sense. It does defy our human logic, at least our innate knowledge of taking care of me. And frankly, loving God or others to this extent seems humanly impossible. But what if, from day one, we learn and we teach babies that the commandments are wrapped in God's promise? What if we come to understand the covenant, the promise made by God to Moses so long ago is a promise for you and for me to the 1,000th generation, God says. We hear, "I am the Lord your God, the one God, the I am, the living Christ. I, your God, have liberated you from the bonds that have enslaved you. I will continue to free you from whatever prevents you from fullness of life. I am with you now. I will be with you always." Yes, this promise from the God of all, for all, with all, is what propels us to love our neighbor in seemingly impossible ways. It guides us to extend God's peace and love even to our enemies. It enables us to see the love of Christ in everyone. In everyone. So let's return to sharing the peace. When we share the peace, let us not only exchange a friendly handshake and a word of welcome, let us exchange knowing looks that God has claimed you and me as God's beloved and chosen people of the covenant. Let us always remember God's covenant is meant for you, for me, for us. Amen. And thanks be to God.